I stood in that doctor's office, 8 weeks pregnant with the baby I'd begged my husband for 3 years to give me, and watched him shake hands with the doctor who just told me they were going to terminate my pregnancy and remove my womb entirely, without my consent. See, what I didn't know was that my husband Larry had paid this doctor $50,000. Not to deliver our baby, but to make sure I could never have children. He said pregnancy would ruin my body, that I was too old, that he'd changed his mind. But here's the thing about a woman who's had everything stolen from her. She doesn't stay broken forever. My name is Lainey, and this is the story of how I discovered my husband's unthinkable betrayal, and what I did when the system failed to protect me. They say revenge is a dish best served cold. I served mine in our kitchen. Hello, family and besties. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 100 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Please subscribe to Lifetales by Sally, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Sit back and relax as we dive into the story. Lainey stood in front of the bathroom mirror, hands trembling as she held the pregnancy test, watching the second line appear like a cruel joke she'd seen too many times before. Lainey had always imagined motherhood as her destiny, the one role she was born to play. At 38, with crow's feet beginning to frame her warm brown eyes and silver threads weaving through her dark hair, she'd built what everyone called the perfect life. Her home in the suburbs was magazine-worthy, her career as a senior marketing executive was thriving, and her husband Larry was the kind of man other women envied. Tall, successful, attentive in public, always ready with a compliment about how beautiful she looked. But behind closed doors, Larry was a different person entirely. The controlling behavior started subtly after their wedding 3 years ago. First, it was suggestions about her wardrobe. That dress makes you look heavier, babe. Then comments about her gym routine, her meal portions, the way she styled her hair. Lainey had brushed it off initially, thinking he just wanted her to be her best self. Isn't that what loving partners do? Motivate each other? The pregnancy conversation had become their recurring nightmare, a toxic relationship pattern that played out every few months like a scripted drama neither could escape. Lainey would bring it up during dinner, her voice soft and hopeful, painting pictures of nurseries and baby names and family vacations. Larry would tense immediately, his jaw tightening in that way that made her stomach drop, and he'd launch into his well-rehearsed monologue about timing, finances, and his favorite weapon, her body. "You're not 25 anymore, Lainey," he'd say, cutting into his steak with surgical precision. "Pregnancy at your age? It'll destroy everything you've worked for. Your figure, your skin, your energy." I fell in love with this woman, he'd gesture at her with his fork. Not some exhausted, stretched-out version. The words cut deeper each time, toxic manipulation disguised as concern, emotional abuse wrapped in the language of love. Lainey would retreat to the guest bedroom, crying silently into her pillow, wondering when she'd become so small, so willing to shrink herself to fit into someone else's vision of perfection. Her friends had stopped asking about kids. Her mother had stopped calling with gentle hints about grandchildren. Everyone had accepted that Lainey and Larry were a child-free couple by choice, never knowing the truth, that it was his choice, not hers. But Lainey couldn't let it go. The ache for motherhood consumed her, a grief that lived in her bones, manifesting in the way she'd linger too long in the baby section at Target, or how her heart would crack watching her sister's kids blow out birthday candles. She'd researched fertility treatments, read every article about pregnancy after 35, joined online support groups for women trying to conceive with unsupportive partners. The consensus was always the same. "Girl, why are you with him?" But leaving wasn't that simple. Lainey had invested years into this marriage, built her entire identity around being Larry's wife, and somewhere along the way, she'd forgotten who she was without him. The manipulation intensified whenever she pressed harder. Larry would weaponize her insecurities, pointing out celebrity moms who bounced back at 25 versus those who let themselves go after 40. He'd show her articles about pregnancy risks, maternal mortality rates, gestational diabetes, anything to plant seeds of fear. "I'm protecting you," he'd insist, his hand on her shoulder in a gesture that felt more like a restraint than comfort. "You don't see it now, but you'll thank me later." Then came the breakthrough moment, or what Lainey thought was a breakthrough. It was their anniversary dinner at that expensive Italian restaurant downtown, the one with candles on every table and a pianist in the corner playing love songs that felt like mockery. Lainey had decided this would be her last attempt, If Larry said no again, she'd start planning her exit strategy, maybe contact that divorce attorney her friend had recommended. "Larry, I need you to really hear me this time," she began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I'm turning 39 next month. My window is closing. I've sacrificed this dream for 3 years because you asked me to, but I can't keep sacrificing forever. This isn't just about wanting a baby. It's about who I am at my core. Being a mother is part of my purpose, and denying that is killing something inside me every single day." She'd rehearsed the speech for weeks, striking the perfect balance between vulnerability and strength, making sure not to sound accusatory or desperate. Larry listened, really listened this time, his expression unreadable as he swirled wine in his glass. The silence stretched so long that Lainey's hope began to wither, another rejection forming on his lips. Then he reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "You're right," he said simply, and Lainey's world tilted. "I've been selfish. If this is what you need to be complete, then let's do it. Let's have a baby." The relief that flooded through Lainey was almost religious in its intensity. She'd cried right there in the restaurant, not caring about the mascara running down her face or the other diners glancing their way. Larry had smiled that charming smile, the one that had made her fall in love with him in the first place. And for the first time in years, Lainey felt like maybe, just maybe, they could build the family she'd always dreamed of. Red flags she'd ignored seemed irrelevant now, the gaslighting, the control, the constant criticism of her appearance. He'd changed his mind. He'd chosen her happiness over his preferences. Isn't that what love looks like? Compromise? Growth? They'd started trying that very night, and for the next 3 months, their marriage felt renewed. Larry was attentive again, affectionate, even excited as they tracked ovulation cycles and downloaded pregnancy apps. He'd joke about baby names and nursery colors, paint a future so vivid that Lainey could almost touch it. When she finally saw those 2 pink lines, confirming what her body had already been whispering, she'd run to tell Larry with the kind of pure joy she hadn't felt since childhood. His reaction was everything she'd hoped for, tears in his eyes, spinning her around the kitchen, calling her his beautiful baby mama. They'd celebrated with sparkling cider and plans for the first ultrasound, discussing which doctor to choose and what pregnancy books to buy. For the first time in their marriage, Lainey felt like an equal partner, like her dreams mattered as much as his image of perfection. But something shifted in those early weeks, subtle enough that Lainey dismissed her instincts as pregnancy hormones. Larry became obsessed with her prenatal care, insisting on researching doctors himself, making all the appointments, even calling clinics to verify their credentials. He'd found Dr. Richardson, a well-reviewed obstetrician across town, and booked their first appointment without consulting her. "I want only the best for you and our baby," he'd explained, and Lainey had been touched by his involvement, mistaking control for care, a pattern that would soon prove devastating. The morning of their first prenatal appointment arrived with the kind of sunshine that felt like a blessing, golden light streaming through their bedroom windows as Lainey dressed carefully in a floral maternity dress she'd bought the day after getting that positive test. She was only 8 weeks along, barely showing, but she'd wanted to feel the part, to embody this new identity she'd fought so hard to claim. Larry had been unusually quiet during breakfast, pushing eggs around his plate while scrolling through his phone, but Lainey attributed it to nerves. This was his first time becoming a father too, after all. Dr. Richardson's office was located in a medical complex on the outskirts of town, far from their usual haunts, which Larry had explained was intentional. "Privacy," he'd said. "I don't want our business broadcast all over the neighborhood." It made sense to Lainey, who'd already started noticing how people treated pregnant women differently, the unsolicited advice and invasive questions that came with showing even the slightest bump. The clinic itself was modern and sterile, all white walls and chrome fixtures, with abstract art that probably cost more than most people's cars hanging in the waiting room. What struck Lainey as odd, though she didn't voice it at the time, was how familiar Larry seemed with the place. He navigated the hallways without hesitation, knew which elevator to take, even nodded at the receptionist like they were old acquaintances. "Have you been here before?" Lainey asked as they settled into uncomfortable waiting room chairs, surrounded by other expectant mothers in various stages of pregnancy. Larry barely glanced up from his phone. "Research, remember? I wanted to scope it out, make sure it was worthy of my girls." He'd placed his hand on her still flat stomach, and Lainey had melted, her suspicions evaporating like morning dew. The appointment itself started normally enough. Dr. Richardson was a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and the kind of confident demeanor that came from decades of delivering babies. He'd congratulated them warmly, reviewed Lainey's medical history, and ordered the standard battery of tests: blood work, urine sample, the works. Then came the ultrasound, that magical moment Lainey had fantasized about since childhood, watching her baby appear on the screen like a tiny miracle. The heartbeat filled the room, fast and strong, and Lainey had gripped Larry's hand so tight her knuckles went white, tears streaming down her face as she whispered, "That's our baby. That's really our baby." Larry had smiled, but something about it didn't reach his eyes. A disconnect Lainey noticed, but immediately dismissed as her imagination running wild. Pregnancy brain, she'd thought, or maybe just the overwhelming emotion of the moment distorting her perception. Dr. Richardson printed out several ultrasound photos, handing them to Lainey like precious artifacts, which to her they were. She'd stared at that grainy black and white image the entire ride home, tracing the outline of her baby's head with her finger. Already so in love it physically hurt. But then Dr. Richardson had said something that lodged itself in Lainey's mind like a splinter she couldn't quite reach. "Lainey, I'd like to see you back in 2 weeks for a follow-up. There's a procedure we discussed that we should schedule sooner rather than later." Lainey had looked up, confused, glancing between the doctor and Larry. "What procedure? I thought everything looked good." Dr. Richardson had exchanged a glance with Larry, brief, almost imperceptible, but loaded with meaning that made Lainey's stomach clench. "Just routine for women your age," Larry had interjected smoothly. "We talked about it when I came to pre-screen the clinic. Nothing to worry about, babe. The thing about gaslighting is that it's most effective when mixed with truth." Larry had indeed visited the clinic beforehand. Lainey had proof of that in how comfortable he'd seemed navigating the space. So when he assured her this procedure was routine, standard protocol for geriatric pregnancies, a term that made her flinch every time she heard it, she'd accepted his explanation, swallowing the anxiety that kept trying to surface. After all, Larry had finally given her the baby she'd begged for. Why would he do anything to jeopardize that? The logic seemed sound, even as her intuition screamed warnings she wasn't ready to hear. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of pregnancy symptoms and preparation. Lainey threw herself into nesting, researching cribs and car seats, joining online mommy groups where women shared belly photos and complained about morning sickness with the kind of camaraderie she'd always craved. She'd posted her ultrasound photo with the caption, "Dreams do come true," and received hundreds of congratulatory comments from friends and strangers alike. Her mother had cried on the phone, already planning the baby shower, talking about finally becoming a grandmother after years of patient waiting. Lainey's sister had sent a care package full of pregnancy essentials: ginger candies for nausea, cocoa butter for preventing stretch marks, a journal for documenting every milestone. Larry, meanwhile, had become increasingly attentive in ways that felt almost suffocating. He monitored everything she ate, vetoing certain foods with concerns about listeria or mercury, or whatever pregnancy risk he'd read about that day. He'd installed tracking apps on her phone for safety, insisting he needed to know where she was at all times in case something went wrong with the baby. He'd even suggested she cut back on work, maybe take early maternity leave, which Lainey had resisted. She'd worked too hard building her career to abandon it now, especially when pregnancy discrimination was so rampant in corporate America. Their arguments about her independence had intensified, Larry framing his control as protection while Lainey fought to maintain autonomy over her own body and choices. "You're being reckless," he'd snap when she insisted on going to the gym or meeting friends for lunch. "That baby needs you to prioritize differently now. Or are you saying our child isn't important enough for you to make sacrifices?" It was masterful manipulation, twisting her desire for normalcy into evidence of bad motherhood before she'd even given birth. And Lainey, desperate to prove she could be the perfect mother Larry seemed to demand, would cave, canceling plans and staying home, her world shrinking to the size of their house. The follow-up appointment arrived too quickly. Lainey had been experiencing normal first trimester symptoms: exhaustion, mild nausea, tender breasts, all signs that her pregnancy was progressing healthily. She'd even started showing the tiniest bump, barely visible under loose clothing, but undeniably there when she stood naked in front of the mirror, running her hands over the curve of her stomach with wonder. She'd taken dozens of photos on her phone, documenting every millimeter of change, imagining the day she'd show these pictures to her child and say, "This is when I first knew you were real." Dr. Richardson greeted them with the same professional warmth. ushering them into an examination room that felt colder than Lainey remembered. The nurse who took her vitals was different this time. Younger, less chatty, avoiding eye contact in a way that made Lainey's skin prickle with unease. "Everything okay?" Lainey had asked, trying to keep her tone light. The nurse had smiled tightly. "Doctor will be right with you," she'd replied, practically fleeing the room. When Dr. Richardson entered, Larry was already there, having excused himself to use the bathroom, but somehow appearing from a different direction entirely, like he'd been in consultation somewhere else in the building. They'd exchanged another one of those loaded glances, and this time Lainey couldn't ignore it. "What's going on?" she demanded, her voice sharper than intended. "You two keep looking at each other like you're in on some secret, and I'm starting to feel like the only person who doesn't know what's happening with my own pregnancy." Dr. Richardson had settled onto his rolling stool, clasping his hands in that way doctors do when they're about to deliver bad news. "Lainey, Larry and I have discussed the best course of action for your situation, given your age and the risks associated with geriatric pregnancy. We believe the safest option, for both you and any future family planning, is to terminate this pregnancy and perform a hysterectomy." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, so absurd that Lainey had actually laughed, a sharp, hysterical sound that didn't feel like it came from her body. "I'm sorry, what? Terminate? Hysterectomy? There must be some mistake. My pregnancy is healthy. You said so yourself 2 weeks ago." She'd turned to Larry, expecting him to share her outrage, to defend their baby against this insane suggestion. But Larry's expression was calm, almost relieved, like a burden was finally being lifted. "Babe, listen," Larry had started, reaching for her hand, but Lainey recoiled like he'd tried to strike her. "This is for the best. I've been doing research, talking to Dr. Richardson about the complications that could arise. The risk to your health is too significant. And honestly," he'd paused, and this is the moment Lainey would replay in her mind 10,000 times, analyzing every microexpression. "I've been having second thoughts about the whole pregnancy thing. Your body is already changing, and I think we rushed into this. A hysterectomy means we never have to have this argument again. Clean slate. Just us the way it should be." The examination room seemed to tilt and spin, walls closing in as Lainey processed what she'd just heard. Not from some stranger, but from the man she'd married, the man who'd promised to build a family with her, the man whose baby was currently growing inside her body. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry insects, and somewhere in the building, a phone was ringing, mundane sounds that felt obscene against the backdrop of her entire world crumbling into dust. "You planned this," Lainey whispered, her voice barely audible as the pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. "The research. The specific doctor. Those looks you keep exchanging. You never wanted this baby. You lied to me, got me pregnant, and now you're trying to." She couldn't even finish the sentence, the reality too horrific to speak aloud. Her hand instinctively moved to her stomach, protective, as if she could shield her child from the conspiracy unfolding around them. Dr. Richardson cleared his throat uncomfortably, suddenly very interested in the chart on his clipboard. "Mrs. Harrison, I understand this is emotional, but from a medical standpoint." Lainey cut him off, her shock crystallizing into fury that burned through her veins like wildfire. "Medical standpoint? What medical standpoint? My pregnancy is healthy. There are no complications. You're talking about killing my baby and destroying my ability to ever have children because my husband paid you to, didn't he? How much? How much did it cost to buy a doctor's ethics?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Larry stood abruptly, his charming mask slipping to reveal something cold and calculating underneath, the true face she'd been too in love to recognize all these years. "You're being hysterical," he said, using that condescending tone he always deployed when she challenged him. "This is exactly why I had to handle things myself. You're too emotional to make rational decisions. Dr. Richardson is recommending what's best for your health, but you're so obsessed with this motherhood fantasy that you can't see I'm trying to save you from yourself." Classic narcissistic manipulation, taking an act of profound betrayal and flipping it to make himself the hero. Lainey the unstable villain who couldn't appreciate his sacrifice. She'd read about this pattern in the psychology articles she'd devoured late at night, trying to understand why her marriage felt like drowning. Gaslighting. Darvo, deny, attack, reverse victim and offender. The toxic relationship playbook executed with surgical precision by someone who'd studied her vulnerabilities for years and knew exactly which buttons to push. I'm leaving, Lainey announced, standing on shaky legs, grabbing her purse with trembling hands. And I'm finding a real doctor, one who hasn't been corrupted by whatever sick arrangement you two have. Don't follow me, Larry. Don't call me. Don't even look at me right now, or I swear to God. She didn't finish the threat, but something in her eyes must have convinced him she meant business because he stayed seated, jaw clenched, that muscle twitching near his temple the way it always did when he was losing control. Dr. Richardson tried one last manipulation tactic, his voice taking on a paternal concern that made Lainey's skin crawl. Lainey, if you walk out of here without addressing this, I'll have to note in your medical file that you're refusing necessary treatment against medical advice. That could affect your insurance, your ability to find another provider willing to take on a high-risk patient. But Lainey was already gone, practically running through the clinic corridors, past the waiting room full of pregnant women who had no idea they were sitting in a building where doctors conspired with husbands to steal futures, past the receptionist who called after her about scheduling follow-ups, out into the parking lot where the sunshine felt like mockery against her apocalyptic internal landscape. She sat in her car for 20 minutes, hyperventilating, hands gripping the steering wheel so tight her fingers went numb. The ultrasound photo was still clipped to her sun visor, that tiny blob of cells that represented everything she'd ever wanted, now marked for execution by the two men she'd trusted most. Lainey pulled out her phone with shaking hands and started searching for women's health crisis lines, pregnancy advocacy groups, anyone who could tell her this was illegal, that she had rights, that Larry and Dr. Richardson couldn't just decide to terminate her pregnancy and sterilize her without consent. What she found was both reassuring and terrifying. Legally, they couldn't perform any procedure without her explicit written consent. That was basic medical law. But she also discovered horror stories of women whose partners had forged signatures, bribed medical staff, or used coercive control tactics to manufacture consent that stood up in court. Some women had woken up from what they thought were routine procedures to discover their reproductive organs had been removed. Others had been declared mentally incompetent by corrupt doctors working with abusive partners. The system that was supposed to protect women often failed spectacularly when money and manipulation entered the equation. Lainey drove to her sister's house across town, barely remembering the route, operating on autopilot while her brain tried to process the betrayal. Maya answered the door with a smile that immediately vanished when she saw Lainey's face, tear-streaked, mascara running, that wild-eyed look of someone whose reality had just shattered. What happened? Is it the baby? Maya pulled her inside and Lainey collapsed on her sister's couch, the whole story pouring out in gasping sobs. Larry's manipulation, the doctor's conspiracy, the planned termination and hysterectomy, everything. Maya's expression shifted from concern to rage, that protective older sister instinct kicking in hard. That psychopath. I never trusted him, Lainey. Remember when I said something felt off about how controlling he was? You thought I was overreacting, but this is criminal. We're calling the police right now. And a lawyer. And we're getting you somewhere safe because if Larry is crazy enough to plan something like this, who knows what else he's capable of. They spent the rest of the afternoon building Lainey's escape plan. Maya's husband, a former prosecutor, made calls to colleagues in family law and criminal defense. The consensus was disturbing. While conspiracy to perform an unwanted medical procedure was technically assault, proving it would be difficult without recordings or documentation. Dr. Richardson could claim it was a misunderstanding, that he'd presented options and Lainey had overreacted. Larry could play the concerned husband worried about his emotionally unstable wife. Without concrete evidence, it became a he-said-she-said situation that rarely went the woman's way. But then Maya had an idea that was either brilliant or insane, possibly both. You need to go back, she said, and Lainey looked at her like she'd lost her mind. Hear me out. You go back to that clinic with a recording device. Get them to admit what they planned. Get Larry on tape explaining how he orchestrated this. That's evidence that will stand up anywhere, in divorce court, criminal court, medical board hearings. We nail these bastards properly, or they'll just do it to some other woman. Lainey's hands moved to her stomach again, feeling that barely there swell that represented her child's existence. The mama bear instinct was already strong, that primal need to protect her baby overriding her own fear. If she ran now, Larry would spin the narrative, make her look unstable, unfit, maybe even try to have her institutionalized using Dr. Richardson's medical authority. But if she gathered evidence, if she exposed the conspiracy, She could protect not just her own child, but potentially save other women from Larry's particular brand of evil. The next morning, Lainey returned home to find Larry pacing the living room, his concern seeming genuine to anyone who didn't know the truth. "Baby, thank God. I've been worried sick. You just ran off without your prenatal vitamins, without—" Lainey cut through the performance with chilling calm. "I'm sorry," she lied smoothly, channeling every acting skill she possessed. "You were right. I was emotional. Hormones, you know. I've been thinking about what you and Dr. Richardson said, and maybe you're protecting me from something I can't see clearly right now." The relief on Larry's face was almost comical, his ego so massive that he actually believed she'd capitulated, that his manipulation had worked once again. "I'm so glad you're seeing sense," he said, pulling her into a hug that made Lainey's skin crawl. "This is for us, for our future. We can travel, enjoy our lives without the burden of children. You'll keep your figure, your freedom. We'll be that couple everyone envies." His words were poison disguised as promises, and Lainey nodded against his chest, her phone recording everything from her back pocket. She played the compliant wife for 3 days, gathering evidence like a detective building a case. She recorded Larry on the phone with Dr. Richardson, discussing moving forward with the procedure and keeping Lainey calm until the appointment. She found emails on Larry's laptop. He'd never bothered with strong passwords, his arrogance assuming she'd never think to look. Detailing the financial arrangement with the doctor, $50,000 to perform an unauthorized termination and hysterectomy, make it look like emergency complications. The evidence accumulated like ammunition, each recording and email another nail in Larry's coffin. Lainey methodized everything, sent copies to Maya's encrypted cloud storage, forwarded files to the lawyer, even printed physical backups that she hid in her office desk at work. She documented dates, times, conversations, building an airtight case that would destroy Larry professionally, legally, and socially. But something darker was growing inside her alongside the baby, a rage so consuming that legal justice started to feel inadequate, too slow, too uncertain in a system designed to protect men like Larry. The scheduled appointment loomed, Friday at 2 o'clock, the day Dr. Richardson had blocked off extra surgical time for what Larry had coded as procedure for high-risk patient. Lainey confirmed she'd be there, playing her role perfectly, the submissive wife who'd finally accepted her husband's wisdom. Larry was practically giddy that morning, making her favorite breakfast, talking about the vacation they'd take once she'd recovered. As if recovering from forced sterilization was like bouncing back from the flu. His sociopathic disconnect from the horror he'd orchestrated was stunning, a window into how truly broken his capacity for empathy had always been. Maya had begged Lainey to go to the police immediately, to get a restraining order, to disappear into witness protection if necessary. The lawyer had draft divorce papers ready, along with a lawsuit against Dr. Richardson that would annihilate his medical license and potentially land him in prison. Everything was in place for legal warfare that Lainey would almost certainly win. She had the evidence, the clear victim narrative, the sympathetic angle, pregnant woman betrayed by husband and doctor, that would dominate news cycles and turn public opinion firmly in her favor. Justice was within reach, sanctioned and civilized. But Lainey couldn't shake the feeling that legal justice was insufficient for what Larry had done. Court cases dragged for years. Appeals and technicalities could reduce sentences. Money bought the best lawyers who knew every loophole, every way to spin a narrative until the victim became the villain. And even if Larry went to prison, he'd eventually get out, free to manipulate and abuse other women, to steal other futures with that charming smile and calculated cruelty. The system wasn't designed to truly stop men like him. It was designed to rehabilitate, to forgive, to offer second chances that men like Larry exploited ruthlessly. Thursday night, Lainey lay awake beside her husband, listening to him snore peacefully while she cradled her stomach and felt her baby move for the first time. Tiny flutters like butterfly wings, proof of life that Larry had sentenced to death. She thought about all the women who'd come before her, the ones who'd taken the proper channels and still lost everything. She thought about her daughter or son growing up without a mother because Larry had eventually succeeded in one of his schemes. She thought about the next woman he'd charm and control and destroy because that's what predators did. They moved on to fresh victims while leaving wreckage in their wake. The decision crystallized with terrifying clarity. Some evils were too great for the slow, grinding wheels of justice. Some monsters needed to be stopped permanently, by any means necessary. Lainey had never considered herself capable of violence, had always been the peacemaker, the compromiser, the woman who absorbed abuse and called it love. But motherhood had awakened something primal, something that transcended her socialized need to be nice, to follow rules, to trust systems that consistently failed women. Her baby deserved a future, and Larry was the only obstacle standing between her child and life. She started planning with the same meticulous attention Larry had brought to destroying her dreams. She researched methods that would appear accidental. Household chemicals that caused heart attacks, staged falls downstairs, carbon monoxide leaks from faulty water heaters. She studied crime investigation procedures, learned what forensic teams looked for, how to avoid the mistakes that caught amateur criminals who acted on emotion rather than strategy. If she was going to do this, it needed to be perfect, untraceable, the kind of death that left investigators shrugging at tragic accidents. Friday morning arrived with unsettling normalcy. Larry kissed her forehead, told her how proud he was that she was being brave, promised her they'd celebrate afterward with expensive champagne. His insensitivity so profound he couldn't even fake appropriate solemnity about terminating a pregnancy. Lainey smiled and nodded, playing her part one final time, her phone recording his cheerful discussion of dinner reservations and weekend plans, evidence she'd never need to use now. But she didn't go to Dr. Richardson's office. Instead, she drove to the police station, walked in with her meticulously organized evidence, and filed a formal complaint against both Larry and the doctor for conspiracy to commit assault, coercion, and attempted forced sterilization. She met with detectives for 6 hours, walking them through every email, every recording, every piece of documentation that proved premeditation. The case was airtight. Criminal charges would be filed within days, arrest warrants issued, both men facing serious prison time. When Lainey finally returned home that evening, Larry was waiting, pacing furiously, his phone blowing up with calls from Dr. Richardson, whose office had just been raided by investigators. The mask was completely gone now, replaced by raw fury that made Lainey's blood run cold. "What did you do?" he snarled, grabbing her arm hard enough to bruise. "You stupid bitch, you just destroyed everything. My reputation, my career, our marriage. Over some emotional breakdown about a pregnancy you're too old to handle anyway." Lainey wrenched her arm free, backing toward the kitchen where she'd strategically placed her phone on the counter, camera recording everything. "I saved my baby," she said simply. "And I saved every other woman you would have manipulated after you destroyed me. You're going to prison, Larry. Both of you. And everyone is going to know exactly what kind of monster hides behind that charming smile." What happened next would forever be disputed in court records and media coverage. Larry lunged at her, shouting about how she'd ruined his life, hands reaching for her throat with murderous intent clearly visible on camera. Lainey grabbed the cast-iron skillet from the stove, her grandmother's vintage pan that weighed close to 5 pounds, and swung with every ounce of strength her body possessed, fueled by months of suppressed rage and the primal need to protect her unborn child from immediate danger. The pan connected with Larry's temple with a sickening crack that echoed through the kitchen, and he crumpled to the tile floor like a puppet with cut strings. Blood pooled beneath his head, spreading in a dark halo that seemed almost artistic against the white grout. Lainey stood over him, chest heaving, the skillet still gripped in her trembling hands, and felt absolutely nothing. No guilt, no horror, just profound relief that the threat was neutralized, that her baby was safe, that she'd never have to shrink herself again. She called 911 with remarkable calm, explained that her husband had attacked her after discovering she'd reported his conspiracy to police, that she'd defended herself and her pregnancy with whatever weapon was available. The responding officers found her sitting on the front porch, dried blood on her hands, the recording still running on her phone, documenting everything. The house was full of evidence. Larry's emails, the recordings, even a draft consent form for the hysterectomy with a forged signature that Dr. Richardson had prepared in advance. The trial became a media sensation, dominating news cycles for months. Pregnant woman kills husband who plotted forced abortion ran on every major outlet, sparking fierce debates about domestic violence, reproductive rights, bodily autonomy, and the limits of self-defense. Legal experts argued whether killing an unarmed man constituted reasonable force, while women's advocacy groups rallied around Lainey as a symbol of resistance against patriarchal control. Dr. Richardson turned state's evidence, confirming every detail of Larry's conspiracy in exchange for a reduced sentence, his medical license revoked permanently. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a verdict of not guilty, justified self-defense in protection of herself and her unborn child. The courtroom erupted in applause, bailiffs struggling to restore order as Lainey collapsed in her lawyer's arms. 7 months pregnant now with a daughter she'd already named Maya Grace, after her sister who'd stood by her through everything. The judge addressed her directly, an unusual break from protocol, saying, "Mrs. Harrison, no woman should have to fight this hard for autonomy over her own body. You're free to go build the life you deserve." Lainey's story isn't about revenge. It's about reclaiming power stolen by someone who claimed to love her while systematically destroying her from within. It's a reminder that sometimes the people closest to us are the ones capable of the deepest betrayal, hiding monstrous intentions behind masks of concern and affection. Her journey teaches us that self-preservation isn't selfish, that protecting your future and your children's futures matters more than preserving toxic relationships built on control and manipulation. The real lesson isn't about violence. It's about recognizing warning signs before they escalate to catastrophic levels. It's about trusting your instincts when something feels wrong, even when the person manipulating you is someone you love. It's about understanding that you don't owe anyone access to your body, your reproductive choices, or your future, regardless of marriage vows or societal expectations. And perhaps most importantly, it's about knowing that sometimes survival requires hard choices that civilization judges harshly, but circumstances demand absolutely. Lainey gave birth to Maya Grace 3 months after the trial, surrounded by family who'd supported her through the impossible. She rebuilt her life piece by piece, became an advocate for domestic violence survivors, and raised her daughter to understand that love never requires you to become smaller, quieter, or less than who you were meant to be. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, share it with your friends, and tell us what you learned in the comments below.